In this video, we'll be building and deploying a full stack application using the GrandStack. Specifically, we'll be using the GrandStack Starter project, which is a template that allows us to quickly spin up a GrandStack app. If you're not familiar with the GrandStack, it is composed of GraphQL, which is a tool for building and querying APIs, React, which is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces, Apollo, which is really a suite of tools for working with GraphQL on both the server and the client, and the Neo4j database, which is a native graph database. GraphQL makes the observation that your application data is a graph and uses a graph model for the API, so we get a lot of benefits in using a graph database as the data layer for a GraphQL service. We'll use the GrandStack Starter project, which is available on GitHub. The GitHub page also contains docs that explain how it works, how to extend it, how to deploy it. It's really composed of two projects, a UI application and an API application. The UI project is a React app, and the API project is a Node.js GraphQL service that uses a Neo4j instance as the data layer. Here's an overview of how a simple GrandStack application works. The client is a React application that uses the React Apollo client integration to query a GraphQL service, which then in turn fetches data from a Neo4j instance. Here's how our example maps to the two projects within the GrandStack Starter, where the UI project is in green, the API project is in blue, and they both speak GraphQL to send and receive data. Once we get our app up and running locally, we'll be using Zeit now to deploy it. Zeit is a really easy to use service for deploying and hosting Node.js apps like our GraphQL service, static pages like our React app. We can even deploy Docker containers. It has a free OSS tier that makes it really easy to get started with. Okay, so let's head on over to grandstack.io to download our starter project and get started. So I'm going to go to grandstack.io and click download. This will download a zip file with the source of the latest release of the GrandStack Starter project. And we can see within here that we have two top-level directories, one for our API application and one for our React application in the UI directory. So I'm going to jump over to my text editor and we'll open up this GrandStack Starter directory that we just downloaded. Okay, let's start with the API project. So package.json is open. We can see we're declaring the dependencies that we need for this project. So let's go ahead and run npm install. We're grabbing Apollo server, which will help us spin up our GraphQL API. We're grabbing the JavaScript Neo4j driver, and we're also grabbing Neo4j GraphQL.js, which is a project that will automatically translate GraphQL queries to Cypher, which is the query language for Neo4j, and will handle the calls to the database within our GraphQL resolvers. Okay, so our dependencies are installed. Let's just go ahead and run npm start. And our GraphQL API is ready to go, localhost 4000. Let's jump over to the browser and see what we get at localhost 4000. Now, if we hit this endpoint, localhost 4000, our GraphQL endpoint, if we hit that from the browser, we get this nice GraphQL playground. GraphQL playground is sort of a new version of Graphical. If you used Graphical before, sort of an in-browser IDE for exploring your GraphQL endpoint. So one thing that's really nice is we can explore the schema of our GraphQL endpoint. But before we do that, let's take a look and jump back to the code here so we can see what's going on. So we'll take a look in source index.js, which is our entry point. So we're importing Apollo server, the Neo4j driver, some functions from Neo4j GraphQL.js. We're grabbing some configuration from a .env file, setting those as environment variables. And the first thing that we're doing here is grabbing some type definitions and resolvers. Now these come from GraphQL-schema.js. Let's take a look at that file. So the first thing that we do in building a GraphQL API is define the types and the fields on each type that are available in the API. We do this using what's called the schema definition language. And here's an example. So we have three types here. We have user, we have business, and we have review. So we can see that our application is going to be about users that are writing reviews of businesses. And each of these types has various fields. So user has a name. User also has some friends relation. So they also have reviews that they've written. Similarly, a business has categories that it belongs to. And the final part in our type definition here is the query type. The query type defines the top level queries that we can make to our GraphQL API. So we can search for users by ID or name, businesses by ID or name, and so on. Now the second part of a GraphQL API is the resolver functions. The resolver functions define how to actually fetch the data for the types and fields. And in this case, we've imported the Neo4j GraphQL integration, and for each of our top level query type resolvers, we're just delegating to this integration. So we don't have to define how to actually fetch that data from the database. This Neo4j GraphQL integration is able to inspect the GraphQL query and generate the database query and handle the call to the database to fetch that data for us. So that's all we need to do to define our initial GraphQL schema. Let's jump back over to index.js. And the next thing we're doing is calling augment schema. This comes from Neo4j GraphQL.js. This will add auto-generated mutations. Mutations are the GraphQL, again, top-level entry points that allow us to create and update data. Notice we didn't define any mutations in our GraphQL schema file, so we'll just rely on the Neo4j GraphQL integration to add those automatically by inspecting our schema, which is pretty cool. Then we create a Neo4j driver instance. We're reading from environment variables the credentials for Neo4j. Then we instantiate a new Apollo server instance. In the context, we inject the Neo4j driver. Neo4j GraphQL.js is going to expect that driver instance to be there, and we'll take advantage of that to handle the database calls within our resolver. And then we call server.listen to spin up our GraphQL API. Okay, so now that we've seen the code, we can understand a bit more about our schema here. So we can see our top level queries, we can search for user by name and so on. We can see the fields that are available on the user object. And we also have some mutations. So we can create a new user, we can create a new review, we can connect a user to a review, and so on. And these mutations, these were automatically injected by our Neo4j GraphQL integration. Okay, so let's write a GraphQL query here. Let's search for users named Will, and let's just grab their name and ID for now. And so we run this, and okay, we get an error. So we say connection refused from localhost 7687. Well, what's going on there? Well, this is the default for our Neo4j instance. So by default, we're looking for Neo4j on localhost 7687. So we're getting an error because I'm not running Neo4j. Now, we could very easily spin up Neo4j locally and connect to a local Neo4j instance, but we said we wanted to deploy this. So we want some hosted Neo4j instance that is accessible over the network. So I'm going to go to neo4jsandbox.com, and I'm just going to spin up a blank Neo4j sandbox. So Neo4j Sandbox just allows me to spin up free hosted instances of Neo4j that are accessible over the network. So all you have to do is sign in. I was already signed in with Twitter or something like that. So now we're spinning up a blank Neo4j instance that is being hosted on AWS somewhere. And once this spins up, then I just need to grab my connection credentials in the details tab here. I want to grab first the IP address. And we can see here that we use the Bolt protocol in our connection string. So I'm going to replace localhost with the IP address of my sandbox instance. And then I also need to grab the Bolt port. So there's both Bolt and HTTP. Bolt is the binary protocol that the Neo4j drivers use to connect to Neo4j. In this case, the HTTP port is the port that Neo4j browser is served on. Neo4j browser, this is sort of a query workbench for interacting with Neo4j. So we'll go ahead and open up browser just to see what that looks like, and just to verify that our instance is blank. So we can write a Cypher query that says match on all nodes in the database and just return the count. And yes, we have 0. There's nothing in our blank database. Okay, back to our credentials here. We needed the Bolt port. So 7687 is the default, but these Neo4j Sandbox instances run on a different port. And we just need the username now, which is Neo4j, and the password for this instance. So we'll replace our default password. Okay, so we'll save that in the .env file, and I will need to restart my GraphQL service since the watcher didn't catch that. Okay, so now let's jump back to GraphQL Playground. Let's run our query again to search for users named Will. And this time when we run it, we don't get an error, so this is an improvement, but we don't get any data. So there are no users found with the name field is equal to Will. And this makes sense because we just saw that our Neo4j database is empty. Fortunately, within GrandStack Starter, there's this seed directory which has some GraphQL mutations that we can run to seed the database. So this is just going to create some users and businesses. I'm going to go ahead and get a new terminal because there's a handy npm script that we can run, npm run seeddb. This is just going to run this file, seeddb.js, which just spins up a Apollo client instance and runs these mutations. So you can see we're creating a few users, we're creating a few businesses, we're creating some categories, connecting the business and categories, then we create some reviews. And down here, this returned the result of our mutation query, which is just the data we created. Let's jump back to our Neo4j instance. And now let's just click on this to give us 25 nodes at random. Now we can see that we do have data in our database. So those mutations created some data in the database. and connected those. So here we can see some users that have written some reviews. These reviews are connected to businesses. Those businesses are in categories. Okay, great. So that's some sample data for us to work with. Now, if we go back to GraphQL Playground and run this query, now, yes, we did find a user named Will. We can look for all of his reviews, what business he's reviewing, the name of the business. We can even go down to the categories of each of those businesses. From the review, we can also grab stars and text of the review. Okay, so here's a review of Missoula Public Library that's in category library. Here's a review of breakfast restaurant, Ninja Mike's, and so on. Okay, cool. Let's jump back to the code here. Now that we have it working, one thing that's really neat about the Neo4j GraphQL integration is that we can bring in the power of Cypher to extend GraphQL. So here's a field on user, average stars, that has a @Cypher sort of annotation. This is called a schema directive. And in this case, we're passing in a Cypher query. This is saying find all of the reviews that this user wrote, and then return an aggregation, return the average stars of all those reviews. So this is sort of like a computed field that extends our GraphQL schema by using Cypher. So if we now, for this user, if we add average stars field, this is running as a subquery, but still all within that one Cypher query that's generated and sent to Neo4j. So Will's, on average, leaves 3.6 star review. Okay, great. So that's cool. I think now that we have this running, the next thing we want to do is deploy it. So we're going to deploy it using XiteNow. So if you've already downloaded XiteNow Desktop, then all we have to do is run the now command. This is going to upload our project to XiteNow, and it will give us a unique URL for our project. So while that's building, let's just go ahead and jump to this URL. So while that's building, it will show us the logs for our project. And then once it's deployed, then that will be the URL for our GraphQL endpoint. So instead of querying localhost 4000, we can just hit this GraphQL URL. Okay, great. So now we're hitting this URL hosted by Now. Let's run our query again to make sure this still works. So let's search for users named Will, and let's just grab ID, name, and average stars to make sure this is working. And this is hitting our Neo4j sandbox instance. Yep, okay, so looks like that works. Great. We'll jump back to our text editor. And the next thing we want to do, now that we have our GraphQL service on top of Neo4j running, is to take a look at our UI application. So let's jump to the UI directory. This is a React application that was created with Create React App, which is just a great way to get started with templating out a React application. So we'll do an npm install. We can take a look at package.json for our React app, and we can see we're bringing in React, we're bringing in Apollo Client, we're bringing in Serve. This is going to be used when we go to deploy our application. Okay, so npm install is done. Let's take just sort of a brief look at the code here. So if we take a look at index.js, you can see we've added a few things to the default project that Create React app gives us. The first thing that we've done is create a Apollo client instance, and we're just grabbing the URI for our GraphQL endpoint from environment variables, passing that to our new Apollo client instance, and then we're wrapping our app component in the Apollo provider component, which allows us to inject Apollo client into our React component tree. And then in app.js, we can see here that we have a child component called user list. And if we take a look at user list, this is where we're actually querying our GraphQL API. So in the user list component, we have this query component. If you've used Apollo Client before, previous versions of the React integration used React higher order components. So we would wrap a component and to sort of bind that to a GraphQL query. The new version of React Apollo introduces query components, which are a bit more explicit, I think, of how to specify GraphQL queries. If you're used to the React higher order component approach, that's still available as well. So we're bringing in this query component from React Apollo. We're specifying GraphQL query. This says just find the first 10 users and grab just the name field. Then if we're still loading, render a loading message. If there's an error, give an error message. Otherwise, for each user name that comes back, just add a list item in an unordered list. Okay, let's go ahead and run this. So npm start. And this will build our React app. And we can see that, yep, we've queried some usernames from our GraphQL service. Okay, well, there's a couple things I want to do before we deploy this. One is let's grab our production GraphQL endpoint and let's use that in our .env file so that our React app hits our production GraphQL endpoint. And then also, let's extend this just a little bit. So let's, for each user, let's show their, let's say, average stars for all of their reviews. So let's jump in to user list. And the first thing we're going to do is change the query that we're running. So we're going to update the query to, instead of just the name field, also return average stars. So with GraphQL, we have to specify each field that we want returned. And so what that means then is we want to grab average stars out of the data, and let's make the name bold and just display their average stars. Okay, so we updated the query and we updated the UI just a little bit. So now we should see, yep, for each user, we can see their average stars in addition to just their name. And that came from our GraphQL service. So the final thing for us to do is to deploy this. So I'm going to stop the development server and run now, which again is going to deploy now our React application to Zeit now. Will give us this unique URL. Let's jump back over to the browser. And while this is building, we'll see the logs. So this is using React scripts to build a streamlined build of our React app. And then it's also using the serve npm package just to serve this as static content on Zeit. And once this is done, it will redirect to our simple React app which is going to hit our now production deployed GraphQL service. It will hopefully show us some users and their average stars of their reviews. And there we go. So we're seeing the users from our GraphQL service, which is querying our Neo4j sandbox instance. Great. So we just used the GrandStack starter to spin up a GrandStack app. We saw how easy it was to make use of the Neo4j GraphQL integration to automatically translate GraphQL to Cypher. We saw how to use Cypher in our GraphQL schema to add some additional functionality. We saw how to query our GraphQL service using Apollo Client in our React app. And we saw how to deploy both our GraphQL service and our React app using ZiteNow. So that's really the starting point for building a GrandStack app. There's a lot more we can do. So I want to leave you with a few resources for exploring further. First of all, grandstack.io contains the link to download the starter project that we saw, as well as more documentation. It has information on building GraphQL services with Neo4j and how to use each component of the GrandStack. Neo4j Sandbox, we use that to spin up a blank Neo4j instance, but there are lots of other existing data sets that have browser guides that we can use to learn more about Cypher, more about graph data modeling and different graph use cases. The Neo4j user Slack workspace is a great way to interact with the community, share what you're building, collaborate on projects. Anyone can join it at neo4j.com/Slack. And finally, ZiteNow is the hosting service that we used to deploy our app. So my name's Will. Feel free to ping me on Twitter or out on the internet with any questions you have. Cheers.